How did you get into radio?
Well, Asela, firstly, I must thank you for giving me this opportunity to have a chat with you. Radio has, it was something which I thought I may fare well in. So, SLBC, where I was at, which stands for Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation, had a trailer which was run somewhere around mid-1998, where they were calling for part-time presenters, and I applied in response, and they went through a rigorous training period, and finally made my way into as an impanel relief presenter, as how they termed it, at SLBC from mid-January 1999.
Can you talk about the work you did at SLBC?
Yes, certainly. We all started off under working alongside a senior presenter when we were on air, who taught us the ropes in the radio industry. And it went on to where I started off doing a Monday morning show on All Asia service, which was on shortwave in this region, mainly going into India. We had a huge Indian listenership at that time. So it was a Monday morning on which I sort of perfected the art of becoming a radio presenter. Until there were occasions when we were called on to stand in for some other presenter on the home service, which gave us a little bit of exposure on the home service, which was at that time known as the commercial service of Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation.
How has your work at SLBC helped your current work at Hitz?
I would say my basics of radio broadcasting or in public broadcasting came from the training I received at SLBC. Besides, also SLBC has a very wide selection of music in their library, which is rated as being one of the best in this region. I learned a lot about old music. I would say SLBC had a slight weakness in the contemporary music, so that's where I didn't gain much where SLBC was concerned, but I fine-tuned my presentation in the latter part of years, listening to other private radio stations and how they made presentations, which I thought was more sort of international, more in line with international radio stations. Those are the private radio stations, and then I improved my presentation at SLBC by listening and modifying my approach.
How did you get into Hitz FM?
I was headhunted. The radio industry in Sri Lanka is pretty small. So everyone knows practically everyone, and when they were starting off, before they even started going on air, they started collecting a database of presenters, and that's where they contacted me.
What do you think sets Hitz FM apart from other English radio stations?
Primarily, I would think the visual radio, which has been introduced to Sri Lankan radio. That's where you can see the presenter, and besides hearing the presenter through internet. That has given Hitz FM a unique edge over other radio stations. But besides that, our Hitz crew is, I think, yet another talent which has given an edge over other private radio stations, because they speak very, I would say, clear diction English, where there are no accents, unlike some others. And also, well, to a lesser emphasis, I would think, Hitz has come out with a very wide spectrum of music they offer. They play music of the 60s, coming right up to contemporary music of the millennium.
Hitz FM's website has a video webcast where viewers can see the presenters in the studio. Are you always aware about the camera in the studio, or do you forget about it?
Yes and no, Asela. Some days, there are times we tend to forget that we are being watched, and there are times we are conscious. In fact, when it was introduced, we were all not conscious of what we were doing, and there were many of us who got caught even combing our hair inside the studio without knowing that we were being watched right around the world. So, but now we've sort of got adjusted to it, and there are times we do interact where sometimes we are chatting with some listener who's on Facebook, and then they say, "Why did you wave at the camera?" So we, gently wave at the camera and try to make it more interactive, making use of the camera's presence there.
What is the difference between working on an analog platform at SLBC versus a digital platform at Hitz?
Primarily, I think analog platform does take a lot of people's time. The process of working is very lengthy. It's like trying to catch your nose by taking your hand right around your head. That's how I see it now. But when I was at SLBC, I didn't know about the digital process and how life is very much less complicated, and things that can be processed very much faster if you're on digital platform. Plus the ability to be able to respond fast to listeners, especially when you're handling a request program, which is something which the analog process doesn't permit. It has a lot of more preparation time required when it comes to analog compared to a digital.
What is your opinion of the current state of Sri Lankan radio?
When you consider the private radio stations, well, I think they are pretty good when you compare them with international radio stations. Fairly good. Maybe SLBC is they've gone on to a stage where, although they were a monopoly at one stage, they've now got quite a few senior presenters who are very good at maybe the diction in English and their knowledge in music or the oldies and so forth. But we have a big issue when it comes to the frequency allocations, which is governed by a regulatory body known as TRCL, which is Telecommunication Regulatory Commission of Sri Lanka. We have 18 Sinhalese private radio stations, 5 Tamil private radio stations, 9 English private radio stations. Now, when you look at all these, each of these radio stations have to have about 5 frequencies to cover the entire Sri Lanka. Now, when you look at that alone, they are talking about 160 frequencies. Adding to that is SLBC, who also have about 60 frequencies on their side, which gives a total of 217 FM frequencies in the spectrum. And I feel that spectrum is far too narrow, because now coming from my home in Ratmalana, I hear with 97.0 on Hitz FM, I hear SLBC's Sinhalese Vedantha Seva, which comes on 97 from Radala on 1 kilowatt, coming over a mountain range, because it has line of sight with Colombo. We have Hiru FM on 97. Either 96.7 or 97.3. I think it's 96.7, which is also clashing with 97. We have Vetri, which is a Tamil radio station on 97.3, which is also clashing. So you get a clash of so many frequencies, all because they're operating far too close to each other, which is something TRCL will have to look at, broad basing themselves in that radio spectrum they have currently allocated. Also, Colombo and Kandy are like the primary locations where radio is concerned, because they are geographically, you get a lot of density, population density. Colombo being first. I feel that the regulatory body should allow radio stations to go up to at least 5 kilowatts in their output, whereas what is permitted is only 2 kilowatts. 2 kilowatts has some grey areas like Kandana and Ratmalana, for instance. They are grey areas because they are considered a little below sea level. Whereas if you're on a 5 kilowatt ratio, which one of the private radio stations are doing on, they are being heard in those locations very well. So that is something which TRCSL will have to look at, either increasing the Colombo output to 5 kilowatts and meantime also broad basing themselves on the frequency spectrum which is offered.
Since you go on air as Ron Mason, what made you choose the name?
Well, that's a culture actually in the private radio stations, not at SLBC. SLBC I used to give my actual name, but when I had a brief stint of training with a private radio station before I went on Hitz, where I learnt like the basics of digital operation. That's where I was first asked to look at a radio name for myself. I went onto the web and looked at famous personalities as DJs and radio presenters right around the world, and coined these two names, Mason, and initially it was Jeff Mason, but then I found it difficult to pronounce Jeff Mason, and I found Ron Mason a little easier to pronounce and took on to that.
What is your favorite thing about being in radio?
Well, my passion has always been in music, and the greatest I could, of course, achieve from radio is to be able to be interactive with listeners and be able to cater to their preferences in music. That has been my driving force in being associated with radio.
Thank you.
Well, I'll sign off by thanking you, Asela, for taking the time and giving me this opportunity to have a chat with you on radio in Sri Lanka. Thanks again. Ron Mason from Hitz FM signing off.